Hello, friends, and welcome to one of our beautiful Sunday teachings. My name is Venerable Tarpa. Before we begin, let's take a moment, as we usually do, to appreciate our handsome, wonderful, beautiful, brilliant community that's gathered here today. Today, I feel fortunate to sit as a member of this kind community in the safety and security of like-minded friends, sharing this present moment with others, dedicated to the cultivation of goodness. Today, I'm grateful for the direction and support that this community provides, a community worthy of my time and commitment, a community where my efforts have meaning, purpose, and are appreciated. Today, I'm thankful for this community of awakening, a place to gain the knowledge and skills to improve my life, a family, a home, and a sanctuary for all of us seeking refuge from the storm. And let's remember, as conscientious practitioners, we must recognize our responsibility to the world, to strive to live skillfully while helping others to do the same, to strive to live in balance and harmony with nature and others, to strive to gain mastery over our minds and embody our true benevolent nature, to expand our hearts and minds transcending our shared human limitations, to not intentionally harm sentient life or our planet, and to maturely accept and embrace the reality of our situation while striving to improve it. Once again, hello and welcome to our Sunday teaching. Today we're going to be exploring the Buddhist Mahayana path. So I had some requests to talk a little bit about the Mahayana tradition and the Bodhisattva path. And it's quite the fascinating topic. But this is just going to be kind of a loose teaching. I just thought I'd share what I know about these, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts as well. This is a topic that SBT continues to evolve in, and trying to figure out how much of the Mahayana tradition and path that we're going to follow in our own secular teaching. Before we begin, how about if we start with a brief little history about Buddhism? So right off the top, we have to remember the time in which the Buddha is born and Buddhism starts, the origins. And we're talking about close to 500 years before the birth of Christ. So this is very early on in human history. And so, and as you can imagine, history is quite fragmented at this time. And the story and the origins and the historical dates of the Buddha are vastly different when looked at from the various traditions. So the origin of the Buddha himself, Siddhartha Gautama, in the sutras, can be placed anywhere between the 7th and 4th century BCE. That's a huge dispersion of time, right? We're talking about hundreds of years. So, and that depends on whether it's the Theravada, they have their own dates, the Mahayana have their own dates, Tantra have their own dates as well. And then we have modern scholarly approaches to dating the Buddha through history. The classical dating usually asserts the Buddha's death at about 483 BCE. So this is in the 5th century BCE before Christ. But nowadays, modern scholars have really tried to improve their accuracy of this. Nowadays, a lot of the modern scholars, including some of our great secular scholars like Stephen Batchelor and John Peacock, who's a favorite of mine, a favorite secular Buddhist professor, and they're placing the Buddha's death maybe closer to 400 BCE, which is, again, the 5th century. Now, this would make the Buddha a contemporary of Socrates, which is a little surprising, isn't it? We think of the Buddha as existing so much before, and quite possibly the Buddha having a great influence on Greek philosophy. But nevertheless, So far, there isn't any distinct dates. Um, and between you and me, I'm not sure how important it actually is. I don't know if having an accurate date really helps us to understand the Buddhist teachings in a more accurate context or not. But nevertheless, you can research that on your own. In today's teaching, I'm just going to be sharing what I know about the Mahayana path. I've researched this far and wide in some of my texts and also in my experience traveling around the world to all the Buddhist countries. So I've amassed quite an interesting collection of facts having to do with the with Buddhist history and more the Mahayana tradition. And so I'm just going to be sharing what I know with all of you. I'm not trying to state that I'm an expert on these things. And of course, I always would advise you to do your own research as well. And maybe I can point us in the right direction. As an agnostic Buddhist, I'm not so finicky or particular about having exact details like this. I'm not sure how much those exacting measures have to do with my own awakening. With SBT, we're much more focused on our own practice and awakening than these. But it is beneficial, it's helpful, and more than anything, it's interesting. Okay, so we have the Buddha, and you all are aware of the Buddha's story. I'm not going to go into that, but we're seeing that the Buddha lives about 80 years and teaches the Dharma all over India, and it appears that the Buddha passes away about 400 BCE at the end of the 5th century. So at the death of the Buddha, his teachings start to spread. A lot of people don't realize that during the Buddha's lifetime, Buddhism was a relatively small organization. You know, we hear stories of how Buddhism spread all over Asia and how it dominated all of Asia, but most of that comes far after the Buddha's death. So Buddhism is a fairly small organization within India. After the Buddha passes, as you can imagine, people start to have different interpretations of his teachings, and and various teachers asserting different things. This leads to different views, schools, and traditions of Buddhism. Um, and at one point, Buddhism gets to the point where there's a certain point in history where there's 18 traditions or schools of Buddhist thought that have splintered away from the Buddha's original teachings. For the Mahayana, they always referred to this early group as the Hinayana, and there's a lot of controversy of using the word Hinayana. People believe it to be a disparaging term. The word Mahayana means greater or bigger, Maha in Sanskrit, bigger or greater, and Yana means vehicle. And I always thought vehicle was a weird word. I didn't quite understand it until I understood that it really means the same thing it does nowadays. A vehicle like a car or a boat or a train, something to get you from point A to point B. The Buddhist traditions we call vehicles because that's what they do, right? A vehicle's like jumping in a car and going from samsara to nirvana. So when we have the term Mahayana, it means greater vehicle. And the Mahayana named this original tradition as the Hinayana, which is smaller vehicle or lesser vehicle. And of course, as you can imagine, anyone that follows the Hinayana traditions wouldn't appreciate that kind of terminology. So nowadays they've done away with the term Hinayana and they've given a much more appropriate name, the Nikaya tradition. The Nikayas are the earliest sutras in the Tripitaka in the Buddhist canon, and so the earliest sutras should get the name for the earliest tradition, right? So they call them the Nikaya tradition nowadays. So the Nikaya tradition branched off from the death of the Buddha into 18 different schools of thoughts or traditions, and they spread their way across India. Um, at a certain point, the great Buddhist king, King Ashoka, third century BCE, a few hundred years after the passing of the Buddha, he comes into power, and he becomes the great Buddhist king. He propagates Buddhism across India, turns Buddhism into a very big tradition, and spreads Buddhism around the world. The other thing that King Ashoka does, he gathers all the 18 original Nikaya traditions, and and he brings them together into a council, and they look over these 18 original traditions, because the 18 traditions were fighting among themselves. They had a lot of different views, and there was a lot of discrepancy under what was accurate and what wasn't. So King Ashoka has this big council, invites all the schools, and what they do is they go through and they assess it, and they find a version of it that everyone can agree upon. So King Ashoka creates this beautiful canon of the Nikaya sutras, and then once finished, King Ashoka sends messengers out to the various lands to share it. But most importantly, he sends his daughter and son to Sri Lanka with these teachings to spread them. And then, so in Sri Lanka, that's where these teachings really take hold. And this is the beginning of the Theravada tradition. So I think you all know nowadays we have two basic traditions in Buddhism. We have the Theravada and the Mahayana. Some assert three, the Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, Vajrayana being the tantric vehicle from Tibet. But that's a form of Mahayana. So I think it's at this stage, it's easy just to say the two. So in the world now, so then at this point, there's the Theravada tradition, or at this point, it's still the Nikaya tradition. The term Theravada still hasn't been put upon it. So Buddhism is being practiced, and then comes around the first century BCE, the rise of some new teachings, which we now call the Mahayana teachings, the Mahayana tradition, the Mahayana sutras in India. Now, many people think of the Mahayana as being its own unique school back then that was in competition with the Theravada school. But what actually happened was the Mahayana kind of infiltrated the traditional Nikaya tradition in India. And from my own research and what I was taught, it begins with just a few sutras that kind of make their way in. It's not a complete canon. It's not a collection of sutras. It starts off with just a few individual works that make their way in, and some of the monks find it interesting. Some of the monks start to incorporate this into their own Nikaya tradition. So history shows at the beginning that these monks that start to embrace the Mahayana, they're Nikaya monastics living in those monasteries alongside the regular Nikaya tradition. Slowly, more and more sutras are created until it becomes a movement of itself, and then it branches away from the Theravada. So the idea is at the beginning, there's union between the groups, right? And so it's just these new thoughts and new works that kind of sneak their way into the tradition. Now, so the Mahayana starts in India about the first century BCE, right? About 100 years before Christ. They're built, of course, upon the Nikaya, but the Mahayana are considered more mystical. there's a lot more magic. There's a lot more deities. There's a lot more magical things of the Buddha going on. And what really separates the idea of the Mahayana from the Theravada is the idea of the Bodhisattva and the Bodhisattva vehicle. So in the Theravada tradition, we have the Arhat, which is the highest point of awakening. The Buddha is an Arhat. This is an enlightened being. But a Buddha is considered a very special Arhat. And he's what they call a wheel turning Buddha. He's a, or she is a Buddha who bring in an original teaching and teach the Dharma for the first time. Before the Buddha, the Dharma had been lost, and the Buddha is the first one to bring it back. Though he claims that it's an ancient teaching, it's not his own. He's just one. He's a Buddha who's bringing the teachings back and reteaching it to the world. They call this a wheel turning Buddha. Well, the Mahayana believe that, hey, we can do better than be arhats, that there's a path to actually becoming a Buddha ourselves. And this is the idea of the Mahayana. And another reason why they call it the greater vehicle. They're not happy just being arhats. They're going to do one better. We can become actual Buddhas ourselves. So the Mahayana vehicle is the vehicle of Buddhahood, of becoming a Buddha itself. So you can imagine that's a huge difference between the two traditions. So built upon the Nikaya, so the Bodhisattva means awakened being, right? Bodhi is awakened, Sattva is being, awakened being. Now, the term Bodhisattva is first found in the Theravada or Pali traditions, and it comes from a story of one of the Buddha's past lives in which he was a Bodhisattva. A Bodhisattva is a Buddha in waiting, you might want to say, right? A Bodhisattva somehow knows that they're in their next lifetime, they're going to be reborn and become a Buddha in that lifetime. So that's the definition of a Bodhisattva. Makes more sense, right? Awakened being, right? They're awakened, they just need one more lifetime to become a Buddha. And so it's only mentioned, I believe, one time in all of the Pali tradition, but nevertheless, it's enough for the Mahayana to grab hold of and say, hey, what about this? And maybe we can become bodhisattvas ourselves. With that said, I'd like to just take a second and talk about the Jataka tales. Maybe many of you have read the Jataka tales. They're basically stories of the Buddha's previous lives, but there's some various stories in there different as well. And the thing about the Jataka tales is they've never been considered an accurate source of the Buddha's teachings. And one of the reasons is a lot of the tales can be found in Hinduism and Jainism as well. So it seems more like they're cultural stories that were shared by a lot of different traditions. So Buddhist scholars don't pay much attention to the Jataka tales. Many believe that they're more stories for children that they usually will share at the time of Losar and on holidays. So we'll set those aside. So the Bodhisattva is the awakened being, right? And so the Mahayana construct an idea of the Bodhisattva path, a practice, a methodology, an outline on how to become a Buddha, right? And with that comes some pretty mystical ideas as well. The idea of Pure Lands come into it, which are kind of like Buddha heavens, where a Buddha upon his passing creates a Buddha heaven or Buddha realm, they'll call them. In the heavens, it's a place where people that have the right karma can visit when they pass away, and they can abide there and become enlightened, study from the Buddhas directly. The Mahayanas take the Buddha to almost a godlike level, where now don't be mistaken. The Theravada is still terribly mystical. There's these stories of the Buddha teaching his deceased mother in the heaven realms and the God realms, and walking down the golden staircase back to earth before he teaches it. That's the story of the origins of Abhidharma, one of the Theravada books. So the Theravada have just tons and tons of mystical accounts and magical beings and magical realms. So, but the Mahayana do take it to the next level, and they become a lot more religious, in my opinion, but very mystical. The Theravada believe that most of the Theravada believe that when the Buddha passes away into nirvana, he's no longer accessible to practitioners, that he's passed away, he's gone, it's our turn to liberate ourselves. But the Mahayana believe that the Buddha is still accessible. You can pray to the Buddha. The Buddha can be active in your life. They can answer prayers. They can guide us. And not just bodhisattvas, but also the Buddha's great disciples. And even some Theravada traditions like Goenka's Burma tradition of Theravada, they also, when I was there, I was shocked to see that they prayed to the Buddha's disciples, not to the Buddha, but to his great disciples like Shariputra that can help them in their lives. So there's a lot of mysticism all the way around in all the various traditions, but they do elevate the Buddha to almost godlike level. And then in Tantra, it even goes deeper than that. So the nowadays the modern Mahayana schools are the Tibetan school, Chinese Chan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, Song, which is Korean Zen Buddhism, and Pure Land Buddhisms. So Chan from China, Zen from Japan, Song from Korea are kind of all seen as schools of Zen. In fact, some people say it's just a mispronunciation of the term Zen by the different traditions, that they're all talking about Zen Buddhism. But with that said, they are quite different. When I was there studying in their monasteries, they seemed quite different, not just in sutra material but just their attitudes to it. The Chan Buddhism Buddhists were so soft and beautiful. Some of my favorite monasteries to stay in were Chan Buddhist monasteries in Taipei, in China, and Hong Kong. Zen Buddhism, of course, has more of they have kind of a military style, right? Very disciplined, very hard technique. And the Korean Song practitioners are wonderful as well. And then we have Pure Land Buddhism, which is something worth investigating. It's a very unique form of Buddhism. Many people don't notice that it's actually one of the most popular forms of Mahayana Buddhism in the world. But it also seems like it's a little bit of a combination between Judeo-Christian religion and Buddhism, where they have heaven realms. They believe the Buddha of the West, you can pray to him and have him answer your prayers. And as far as practice goes, their practice can be as simple as reciting a single mantra millions and millions of times within one's lifetime in order to be born into that pure land, and within that pure land become awakened. Many believe that it's impossible to become enlightened in the modern world, and the only way to do it is to be reborn into this pure land and taught by a Buddha there. Sounds very interesting, doesn't it? Sounds very much like a lot of Christian thoughts or Western thoughts on religion. And with that said, Chan Zen and Song Buddhism are often seen as mixtures of Buddhism and Taoism, and they themselves won't deny that there it is quite a mix between the two. Whereas Tibetan is Buddhism, but but of course mixed with their own indigenous religion, the Burn religion. So they're all quite unique in their own way. But I would say they're all pure forms of Buddhism. Okay, so another thing that's quite interesting about Mahayana are the sutras themselves. There's the Mahayana sutras are vast, they're intense, they're quite beautiful, they're quite mystical. But what makes them a little strange is that they're written in the voice of the Buddha himself, the Buddha giving personal instruction to others. Now, historians, the Mahayanas themselves believe that the Buddha taught the Mahayana teachings within his lifetime, but in secret to uh, to a certain amount of advanced students, and they were kept secret until the first century BCE, where they started to come out and people started to be aware of the Mahayana sutras. Historians would say that it's clear that they were written at this later date, right? And they weren't historical documents from the Buddha. They were written around the first century BCE. So it's a little strange that when you read them, it's the Buddha or students of the Buddha talking in their own voice. It's the Buddha saying, do this, don't do that, focus on this. And so that's something for secular Buddhists to try to get our mind around. What does that mean? I've read so many different explanations into why that is. And one explanation that I thought most plausible was that the Mahayana sutras were written by great practitioners in the forests who had visions of the Buddha and teachings, and they wrote them down in first person dialogue to emphasize that it was them watching the teachings for themselves, right? But that's about the only good explanation that I have for it. I'd be curious if anybody else has heard any others. And within the sutras, when we talk about the Paramita Sutras, and the audience is gods and bodhisattvas, and they're floating around them in the sky. Everybody's there, all these mystical beings. So they are quite magical and mystical stories. Another thing that makes the Bodhisattva vehicle a little bit challenging to wrap our minds around is that a great deal of what we know about, or we think we know about the Bodhisattva path, are kind of have a poetic characterization to them, meaning that there's been some beautiful commentaries, especially by masters like Shantideva, who wrote these poem-like affirmations and prayers related to the Mahayana teachings and the Bodhisattva, that they were meant more poetically, but then they got characterized as being factual. And again, this is up to each one of us to figure out for ourselves what we believe is and isn't. I'll show you an example. This is the Dalai Lama's favorite quote by Shantideva. A little bit about Shantideva. So Shantideva comes in about the 9th century. He's an Indian master, Buddhist master from Nalanda University, and he sets the world on fire. He becomes so popular, but he's quite religious. Between you and me, he's not that much of a rational person. He's very passionate. He's quite religious. Nevertheless, he writes countless material on the Bodhisattva path, and it is beautiful. I tell you, it's some material that it used to just bring tears to my eyes reading it. But nevertheless, it is kind of quite poetic. And I believe that Shantideva is what gives Tibetan Buddhism its unique style. I think out of all the styles of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism seems to me, and maybe you will agree, is the most colorful, it's the most warm, has the most warmth. It seems to put more of an emphasis on compassion than the other schools. Of course, all Buddhist schools are focused on compassion, but really specifically with Tibetan Buddhism, right? And there's this affectionate style to the Tibetan style of Buddhism. And well, guess what? It comes from Shantideva. Because Shantideva is in the 9th century, his teachings are preserved in Tibet, but his teachings never go to the east. His teachings never go to the south in the Theravada tradition. So this is what, in my opinion, makes Tibetan Buddhism so unique. It's the teachings of Shantideva himself. Earlier scholars like Nagarjuna, his work went east, right? But Shantideva's didn't. So that's what makes it unique. But look at this beautiful quote. For as long as space endures, and for as long as living beings remain, until then may I too abide to dispel the misery of the world. The Dalai Lama says this is his favorite quote of all time. It's beautiful, isn't it? But it does have to be taken with a grain of salt that this is this has a poetic license. So Shantideva wrote many pieces like this, and it gave people the idea that the Bodhisattva, the story is the Bodhisattva forgoes nirvana or full enlightenment in order to continue to be reborn into this world to benefit others. Now you understand the origin of this poem, right? And of course, many of our practitioners here at SBT might not have a belief in rebirth. I'm just sharing Buddhism with you. You know, clearly Buddhism does, so it's there. But the fact is that's not really. You can learn these things, and then you learn at a deeper level. So in school, they taught us that the actual reason the Bodhisattva doesn't go into nirvana and volunteers to come back is to continue to work on themselves, because nirvana is only a stepping stone according to the Mahayana. The real goal is Buddhahood. How do you do better than nirvana and reach Buddhahood? Well, you have to come back and continue to work on yourself. You have to continue to purify yourself. But it's all done with the intention of it becoming enlightened for the benefit of others. So our bodhisattvas in our group and others, we all take a vow that says that I wish to become enlightened so I can benefit other beings, right? That's the intention of the bodhisattva. And then there's other poems like, may I continue to be reborn until all beings are enlightened before me, including every single blade of grass in the universe, right? And of course, that's a fairly ridiculous thing to say, because plants can't become enlightened, and also there'll always be unenlightened beings because of the cycle of things, how they exist according to traditional Buddhism, right? Insects slowly evolve into higher forms of life, but then there's always beginnings of other forms of life that work their way up. So I just wanted to highlight this kind of poetic characteristic of a lot of the Mahayana teachings, but a lot of people get the wrong ideas on how these things work. I hope that was helpful. So, how about if I share a view of my own? So, we have the Mahayana vehicle arising in the 1st century. So King Ashoka begins this huge movement of Buddhism in India. He becomes the first Indian king, and he's a first Indian Buddhist king, and he's spreading Buddhism everywhere. So starting 3rd century, I think the date is like 250 BCE is Ashoka. So you can imagine, shortly after his life, Buddhism has become a huge thing in India. It's more than just a movement of a few monks trying to become enlightened. It's become a society, a Buddhist society. And to me, that seems like where the Mahayana comes in, because the intention of Buddhism has to change. Buddhism starts in the Theravada tradition or the Nikaya tradition, and it's geared towards individual liberation and mostly monastic, right? The idea is these are practices for individual monastics to become enlightened and benefit society through that, right? It's not a selfish thing, but it is singularly focused. But when Buddhism becomes societal and it starts to spread into all the different realms of society, it has to change, doesn't it? You have to have programs for lay people to become awakened. You have to be able to, these ideas have to be able to embrace society as a whole. And so I think the Mahayana is a natural evolution of Buddhism into this more mass societal movement. And this is another thing that makes Buddhism so popular, that it's no longer just monastics that can become awakened. Now regular people can practice and they can become awakened themselves. And of course, with writing, this is another big boom for the Mahayana. The Mahayana are coming around at just about the same time that the Buddhist scriptures are being written down. Before then, only monastics who chanted them and had them memorized, they were the only ones that knew the teachings. Lay people had no way of knowing them in any way. But around this same time, first century BCE, Buddhism is starting to be written down in both Sanskrit and an early Pali. And so you can imagine it's quite a transformative time of Buddhism in the world, right? So I think it's a natural evolution of it all. But with that said, as secular Buddhists, what does it mean to us? I mean, this is a really intricate question. So the Indian Mahayana, the early Nikaya tradition, the Theravada, they do share a huge amount. There's a huge amount that they're in agreement upon. It really often reminds me of Christianity, of Catholicism, where you have an early Catholic Church, which is basically one tradition, though you have the Greek Orthodox. You have a little bit of variety, which the Theravada do too. Thai Buddhism is slightly different than Sri Lankan, slightly different from Myanmar, but basically the same tradition. But then you have the Protestant that come out of Catholic, and just spread into uh, an amazing amount of different traditions and schools of thought. Buddhism is the same way. You have the Nikaya tradition or Theravada, and then that from there the Mahayana emerges like a Protestant group, and they too turn into this broader array of different traditions as it spreads around the world. Kind of interesting how they're so similar, but also in the same way they kind of share their origins, where Christianity has the Old Testament and the New Testament, and of course, including Judeo Christianity, they all have that in common. Buddhism does too. The early Nikaya sutras are used by everyone. So the basis of Buddhism is the same for all Buddhist traditions around the world, regardless. It's just adaptation from there. So the Mahayana's sutras are added upon the Theravada. And so everyone shares that. And even monastics around the world, they all share the basic Vinaya code, which is our precepts, our rules of conduct, our vows. They're basically the same in all the different traditions. In the East, they simplified it and they brought it down to just basically sometimes as little as 10 vows. But those 10 vows still represent the original 272 vow of the Theravada. Tibetans have 253 vows, but they're basically the same thing, just a little bit of a divergence there. And so, very similar. Okay, so, oh, that was a lot. I gave you guys everything I know about it all. So, with that said, Um, the next question is, well, what does that mean? What does that mean to us? So, when I became a secular Buddhist, of course, I was a Mahayana practitioner, being in the Tibetan tradition. I have Mahayana vows, which are the Bodhisattva vows, and but more and more as I became a secular Buddhist, I kept asking myself, where do I actually fit in with all this? Most secular traditions, most secular schools of thought go back to the early Nikaya sutras because they're believed to be historically probably the most accurate out of the bunch. They're the ones that believe if these are the writings of the Buddha, these early ones seem to be the most accurate. Within the sutras, scholars often say you can kind of detect different voices within the sutra and the sutras, and they talk about three distinct voices. One that has a way of speech that they think would be more accurate as the Buddha's speech. Another one would be Buddhaghosa, who was a great Theravada master who seems to bring a lot of his own views and a lot of his own commentaries in. Even the Theravada masters that I would talk to, they were in modern times, they were all in the process of discerning commentary from sutra. I was quite fascinated by it. And because in the past, all of the Pali Sutras were just taken as the word of the Buddha, including the Abhidharma, which clearly was written hundreds of years after the Buddha's passing. The Abhidharma is the Buddha's first attempt at taking these sutras, which are kind of all over the place, and arranging them into a useful outline and study curriculum. So, um, so as a secular Buddhist, Stephen Batcher himself goes right back to the original sutras, basing everything on that. So that's what secular Buddhists are doing. But with us, what do we do? So with SBT, I kind of started there. And then at the beginning, we had to figure out for ourselves, and we did this together, what it meant for us to be secular. And I remember in the beginning, students wanted to take refuge vows. And I had a debate with them. I said, well, is that something secular Buddhists do? Do secular Buddhists, do we need to take refuge? Do we need a ceremony? And between all of us, we decided that it would be a lovely thing to do. It'd be a lovely act of commitment to our practice. Everyone wanted to take vows, and I agreed. I thought it was beautiful. We did it. At the same time, everybody wanted Tibetan names. I wasn't so sure about names, right? Because secular were moving away from other traditions, but no, everybody was convinced and they wanted Tibetan names. So we did Tibetan names. In hindsight, that was about 4 years ago. Worked out really well. When I gave people refuge vows, I gave them their names. They were so inspired and they worked so hard at it all. Clearly, it was a beautiful thing to do. And of course, I'm a person of commitment, being a monastic, right? I love my vows. I love my commitment. To me, commitment is the real source of our power in practice. And then some time goes by and some students say, I like the refuge, but I really want to dedicate my life to benefiting others. And of course, that's kind of code for the bodhisattva vehicle, right? That's what a bodhisattva is. A bodhisattva takes the vow to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. And so we had to ponder that. And probably some of you remember our conversations about that. And well, we're a secular group. Is that something we do? Are we Mahayanists as being secular? And we had conversations, and it led to me having a great epiphany and realizing that my own bodhisattva vows, my own commitment to benefiting others, this path, this intention, this working towards the attainment of bodhicitta, the mind of awakening. I had the epiphany that I believed it was the greatest aspect of my path that I ever, out of all things. And before that, I didn't realize that. It was quite the epiphany. at how important that was to me. So we decided to do Bodhisattva vows. And that was cool, other than the fact that every group has their own set of Bodhisattva vows. Interesting, huh? Tibetans have 64 Bodhisattva precepts. They're the only ones that do that. The Zen have their own. Even modern traditions like Triratna and others, they all write their own. And because the 64 Buddhist precepts that I took weren't very secular, and to me they weren't very clear. They're quite beautiful, but quite religious. It was clear to me that we should put together something that reflects our secular intention. So I took a long time. It took me a long time to write them, but we wrote our own Bodhisattva vows, which are based on the others. I took everyone's Bodhisattva vows and I put them all on the table in front of me, and put together ours. And I think ours are absolutely gorgeous. 46 vows, which make up our 26 vows. Am I mistaken? 46 for lay ordination, right? Yeah, 26. And you can all read them. They're on you can download them from our website, and quite pretty. So then we got into that. But then we had to decide, or we're still deciding. So I like I like this idea of the Bodhisattva intention. I like the practice, but how far do we get in as Mahayanas? And just having Bodhisattva vows, does it qualify us as Mahayanas? This is a question I'm asking. We don't study the Mahayana sutras. They're quite beautiful. They're filled with a lot of wisdom. Um, I'm afraid, I studied them at the beginning, but I'm afraid over the last 20 years, I've been concentrating so much on the Theravada sutras, the Pali sutras, because that was something I didn't study previously, that I haven't really gotten back to them. There's a lot of mysticism and magic in there. Like we talked about the idea of Buddha realms and all these abilities that Buddhists can have, and so SBT is still trying to figure it out. As far as I know, we're the only Buddhist, secular Buddhist group that entertains the notion of anything Mahayana. But I'm not sure if we can go as far as to say we're Mahayanas, because personally, I don't believe the Buddha wrote the Mahayana sutras. Um, any thoughts? I'm open to ideas.
I kind of look at it as like a Chinese restaurant. You got a whole buffet there. It's all Chinese food. If you want to eat Chinese food, you eat Chinese food, but doesn't mean you have to eat everything on the kind of the same
Yeah,
type of thing.
I like the idea. It's a buffet, isn't it? Yeah. SBT is a buffet, yeah. David?
Lots of things, but just one thing you were saying about the teachings being the Mahayana teachings being not originally from the Buddha, but they said they'd communed with the Buddha. I have read that this the secret teachings is quite a common thing that religions have done. And when somebody comes up with different or new ideas, they say it's been a secret that's been transmitted for centuries.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
the Mormons, right?
the Mormons are a good example.
It's very similar to the Mormon story,
Yep,
yeah.
yep. And in my own culture, the Freemasons believe that their name comes from the Masons who built the temple in Jerusalem in the 1st century, but it was actually made up in the 15th or 16th century, something like that, and they just said, "Oh, it's a secret hidden teaching to give credibility." So it may be the same as that, it may not, but just to share that.
Yeah, the tantric tradition, they believe the same. The Tibetans believe that tantric teachings were taught by the Buddha. Where now the tantric teachings is a little clearer because they're so much later in history that we really do know their origin. They start to develop in India between the third and seventh century. And again, like the Mahayanas, kind of individual practices and sutras, works, and then slowly incorporated together into a tradition. Yeah, quite fascinating. Miss Wangmo?
I guess for me, um, I kind of have the attitude that just because the teaching may not have originally come from the Buddha doesn't mean it doesn't have any value.
Well said.
There's some teachings that a lot of masterful teachers and Rinpoche say that they received in dreams that are some of the most incredible teachings that you will ever come across, that they said they were inspired or received in dreams or that were given to them through dreams. And they're some of the most incredible teachings. So I'm not someone who has the attitude that, well, if we don't think it came from the Buddha, it should be discarded.
Really important that you said that. I should have said it myself. And that's exactly right. In fact, the whole Mahayana vehicle, which I think most people attribute the Mahayana to Nagarjuna, but I don't believe that that would be accurate. I think Nagarjuna was a great philosopher in Nalanda. I'm sure the Mahayana began as smaller works, and maybe Nagarjuna had a lot to do with putting them all together. The story of the teachings is that, if I have it correctly, the Naga king. A Naga is like a serpent fish person, mystical being with magical powers, or they're kind of godlike in their powers. I'm a Naga. I just don't like to show it off, you know. And you should see me in the pool. Uh, but the idea is the teachings were given by the Buddha to the Naga king and kept at the bottom of the ocean. And Nagarjuna dives in and swims down and gets the teachings from the Naga king. And that's the birth of the Mahayana Sutra. So, of course, it must be accurate. How could you deny a story like that one? Dana?
So I, just been bumping into stuff in my life, and that I bumped into Tibetan, Buddhism, and that so I've had this is American Tibetan Buddhism, but for me, and I don't even know that this is true, but I've been told that the Buddha said, don't believe what I say, test it for yourself and figure, and so what I look
True.
to is, there's a lot of magic, that I've been around, I guess, and what I come down to, like, okay, I'll try this and see what happens. And I have tried some, and I've been very surprised that if I have come around to feeling, well, oh, this works for me, and I really don't care about. It's interesting. Don't get me wrong. I like what you're teaching here, but I don't. It's not really that important to me. What's important to me is hearing people that have had some success with going towards enlightenment, feel that they're transforming, and that there's been practices that have helped them, and the bodhisattva, that attitude towards life, that intention. I can see that people have said that this is something that they were taught or whatever, and that they believe and they're doing and has helped them, and so I have no problem with that. That's makes sense to me, and
Well
so
said.
so the same thing that I look for from you is that to see what has been working for you. Not that it's going to work for me, and I
Sure.
don't care if it was something that you learned while you were a musician and that you had some epiphany playing the Doors music or whatever. I don't care. What I care is about being freed from my
You very much so. And you're right about something that a lot of the of practices that might work real well can be veiled in kind of some stories, some supernatural stories, but underneath it all there can be some actual real practices like the Bodhisattva himself and the Bodhisattva themselves. And the Bodhisattva path. There's a lot of mysticism surrounding it and shrouding it, but the practice itself to me has been one of the most beneficial without a doubt in my life. So SBT shares that view with you, Dana. We want to know what awakens us. At the same time, it's a good idea to kind of to be truthful with ourselves and to be discerning on where we get information from so we don't waste our time on practices that might not be fruition at all. When I was practicing, I remember complaining about a practice not seeming to work or maybe even push me in the wrong direction. And I had teachers that say, oh, you might not see a result until your next lifetime or a couple lifetimes from now. And I was never really happy with that answer, you know? It's like, I'll give you a couple weeks or something, but I'm not going to wait a lifetime. So we want to be discerning, but I agree with you completely, Dana. Right now, we're just kind of setting the groundwork. It is, here's an example. I often say that what I think is most important is when we're walking on the path is looking down at our feet, make sure we're walking in the right direction. We're doing it. We're doing the practice. But every now and then you have to lift up your head to see if you're going in the right direction. Because if you're practicing, but you didn't notice, you took a turn and now you're going in the wrong way, it might not be very advantageous. So we need to do a little bit of both. We need to be intelligent. We need to be discerning. And a lot of this is more maybe the job of the teacher to keep everybody focused. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm just taking a moment to give you guys a little direction. And if you notice, I'm not telling anybody what to do or what to believe. I'm just sharing information because I believe all of you can decide that on your own. But I agree with both Wangmo and you that, the Theravada believe that the Buddha is the only one that we can listen to. And to me, that's a sad state of affairs, that after 2 millennium, he's the only teacher that was successful, right? The Mahayana follow a lot of different teachers. All the teachers of Nalanda are worshipped by the Tibetans, not literally, but are highly acclaimed by the Tibetans. Shantideva, Nagarjuna, Chantakirti, all these beautiful scholars. So I'm with you. I think that we can learn from all of these great scholars. It's kind of like just an overriding view of how much emphasis we put on what. And for me, it's more, I'm not making so much of a point, is I'm actually trying to get your assistance to try to figure out, well, how involved are we going to be in it all? Are we going to have Mahayana Sutra study classes, which, they can be very out there, very weird, right? We're talking about all these mystical animals and things and beings. So, again, we're just trying to set the stage, further your education of Buddhism a little bit. And what I like to do, more than telling everybody what Buddhism is showing you these broad ranges of views and ideas. That's what's important. That way you're not pulled into any one, right? Tashi, would you like to share?
Yeah, very quickly. Along with what you're saying and going off of what Ananda said, having, all this to look at, all this to choose from, I look at us as being very eclectic Buddhists. And there's so much out there. So like you said, to pull the best parts of everything, I think is a wonderful thing. And I do like the teachings too.
And I like the word eclectic. That's a nice. So imagine that one of us, again, we don't tell anyone what to practice or what to do. We had a conversation today in our chat about are statues appropriate. I think David brought it up, and Great conversation. Again, I like to stay out of what people do. I just try to educate people. Some people find great benefit. So how about an example that one of our Sangha members decides that they like the Pure Land mantra chanting, Chenrei Rinzigi Ho, whatever that really Tina Turner's favorite. And they did, and for whatever the reason, they might not believe that if they recite it a few million times, they'll go to heaven. But for whatever reason, they find, hey, it somehow gives me some kind of focus. Like, I like what it does for my brain. I get a resonance from it, and I'm going to do it, right? And so much of it is personal. It's a question of what you think you're getting out of it. But if we have a leader that says, okay, everybody recite this mantra 2 million times by next Wednesday, and you're all going to go to heaven, guaranteed, that gets problematic, right? So I think it's great to experiment. I think it's great to look at these different things. We all have different minds. We all have to figure out for ourselves how to awaken ourselves. The only thing I can do is add some guidance, do some teachings like this to broaden your understanding of things. But ultimately, like they say, Buddhas can't wash away sin with water. They can't heal with their hands. Buddhas can't pass on their attainment, their realization onto others. The only thing Buddhas can do, and simple teachers like me, is teach the nature of reality. The only thing Buddhas can do is guide. Even a great Buddha can only guide people. Each one of us has to awaken ourselves. And so for some of you who say, oh, I like the Mahayana Sutras, the Lotus Sutra I read every morning, I read the Heart Sutra, it really seems to do something to me. Wonderful, more power to you. But let's my job is to try to put it all into context for you, right? And to bring some rationality into it. That's something secular Buddhists are committed to, right? Bring a rational voice in to persuade people away from so much superstition and things. There was so much in the Tibetan tradition when I was there. Anybody else like to share? Yes, Miss Wangmo.
I was just going to say, I think it's great to be introduced to things. And because we have the freedom here to create our own practice and to believe what we want to believe, we're all adults. So I think we can handle being introduced to something. And if we say, oh, that's not for me, or that's not what I'm going to practice, or that's mystical and I'm not going to choose to believe that, we can handle that. Do you know what I mean? I don't see any of us being like, oh my God, he's talking about ghosts, I'm so upset. You know what I think we're all adults and we can handle that. But I appreciate the opportunity to be introduced to it, to hear it, to learn about it. I'd rather do that than say we're going to just exclude this because it's somebody, this isn't what somebody might not believe. I think that it's better to be introduced and to learn.
Do you remember when we decided to do the book club on Shantideva's Path of the Bodhisattva? And Shantideva's work is so beautiful, it's so pretty, and he's a favorite among so many people. But it was funny once we got into it, how differently a lot of our opinions were. We started to see with how religious Shantideva's views were and how binary, right? And do this or it's a sin or this. And at the end, I think a lot of us were kind of put off a bit by how narrow-minded it seemed to be. And so, yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah. So we're still kind of figuring it out for ourselves with SPT. What does it mean for us to be secular Mahayanists? That's, being a secular Buddhist is weird enough. To be a secular Mahayanist, that's even weirder. But we'll take on what we can. We even took on a practice, taking the final result as the path, which is actually a tantric practice. We incorporated that, made our own secular practice of it. Yeah. So that's what we're doing. I encourage everybody to read through our Bodhisattva material. So on our download library on our website, you can download the Bodhisattva level practice guide. And after the initial daily practices in the appendix, there's the Bodhisattva vows are there, the Bodhisattva practices are there, information is there. We also have some more videos on our YouTube channel related to secular Buddhism and Mahayana. So really be interested what you all thought of it. But it is a really beautiful path, one that I cherish to this day. I think the most important step I've taken in Buddhism was to become a Bodhisattva. Dana, please.
I just, the one word that you use that resonates with me is agnostic. And so you can teach me anything or bring up anything, and okay, I'm going to test it just in and see if it makes sense to me. I'm an agnostic Buddhist.
Me too. You know, that was originally Stephen Batchelor's phrase. He first considered himself an agnostic Buddhist, and then he changed the term to secular Buddhist or an atheist Buddhist. And I'm with you. I use the word secular Buddhist, but to me, what it really is a agnostic Buddhist. And again, agnostic in the scientific term, understanding of the word, that we understand the nature of knowledge, let alone that knowledge is in a constant state of change. More importantly, our ability to understand is in a constant state of change. So all of knowledge on both sides is in a constant state of change. It's provisional. The idea of certainty is limited, right? Great scientists know this, great philosophers know this, great Buddhists know it, like us. Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah, agnostic. Hey, pretty good teaching, huh? You guys have fun? Interesting? Informative? Yeah. And so we're
Brilliant.
plugging forward. It's kind of fun being on the cutting edge too, right? Being in no man's land, trying to figure out what we are. We're different than all the other secular groups.
Tarpa, do you talk about this in your Tibetan, the writing that you did?
Tibetan Buddhist Essentials?
Yes.
The traditional view of these things are in there.
Okay.
Remember that Tibetan Buddhist Essentials is the Tibetan account of Buddhism, and specifically from my monastery, Sarah J. Monastery, we are working on a text, Secular Buddhist Essentials, which will be SBT's version or my own thoughts on these subjects as well. So, yeah. Great. Dana, did you have another question? Or you just getting comfortable having your hand in the air? Okay. Hey, thanks everybody for joining me and letting me rattle on. It was really fun to share with everybody. I think it's going to be, I think it's valuable information to have. Hey, starting next week, we're into our next 10-week meditation program. And this time it's very exciting because we're sharing a new presentation, which we're all really excited about. We think it's a much more deep presentation and more fruitious presentation of Buddhism than we've had in the past. And I'm busy working on that. So that starts next Sunday. And we'll have instructors in training also beginning. So that's super cool. So with that said, why don't we end today's meditation with our altruistic affirmation? May all be healthy, may all be prosperous, may all be well, may all be present, free of past regret and future worry. May all abide in constant appreciation, which is the source of great joy and contentment. May all realize their true nature and the true nature of reality, which is awakening. Thanks everybody for coming. Remember that the SBT community was created for one purpose, to support you, the practitioner. Thanks again for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Tarpa.